Let's bow our heads for a moment in prayer. Let's pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our salvation. And my prayer in this afternoon is again that you will speak to us, either through me or in spite of me, but that we will hear the words of your whispering in our hearts. Amen. Today we'd like to talk to you about the anatomy of a crisis and how to deal with it. The anatomy of a crisis and how to deal with it. Today is Parents' Day, and if we think of the value of a family, I think of two quotes that are very dear to me. The first is George Bernard Shaw, who said, "A happy family is but an earlier heaven." A happy family is but an earlier heaven. And then Michael J. Fox, the well-known actor, is very sick at this moment. He says, "Family is not an important thing, it's everything." Family is not an important thing, it is everything. The older I get, the more I realize the truth of these words. Family is so important. Family, and a day like today when we celebrate Parents' Day, last week we celebrated Children's Day, family is so important. And the more time I spend with my family, or when I spend time with my family, I realize this is quality time. I have to make quality time of this because it is so important. Family is the place where we feel accepted. Family is the place that affirms us. Family is the space where we feel we can be who we are without judgment. The truth is also on the other side of the coin, and that is that families are subjected not only to pieces of heaven, to be a part of heaven here, but families are subjected to storms. And every family experiences storms. You might experience storms in your family today. Maybe you're reminded of times of storms, times of crisis in your family. And it can do one of two things. Storms can bind us together like nothing else, or storms can rip us apart like nothing else. We cannot always predict the kind of storms that will come in our family, that will show up in our families. We never know. Sometimes a storm can develop and we can see where it's coming. Sometimes it is just out of the blue. But these storms are something that we all have to deal with sometime in our lives. And we all deal with it in a different way. We deal with it in the way that we have been brought up, in the way that we've learned how to deal with crises. But the family are subjected to these kinds of things. And every storm has its own anatomy. It has its own footprint. The one thing that we can say about storms in our lives and storms in our families, storms in our whatever form our family takes on, whatever we can say about that, a storm never leaves us untouched. A storm always leaves some footprints on us. It changes us. how do we deal with storms? How do we deal with these crisis moments that show up in our lives? Well, let's look at Elijah. In the morning services, we journey with Elijah, and we've seen Elijah showing up in the court of Ahab, and he's the prophet. And he tells Ahab, "It will not rain unless I say so." And then, instead of staying in Samaria, God sent him to the brook. And we looked at the whole story of Elijah being fed by ravens and the water from the brook, and then suddenly the brook dried up. And he thought, well, maybe I'm going back to Samaria, maybe I'm going back to where the action is, but God sent him not to Samaria. He sent him to a widow. He sent him to someone, the most unlikely person to feed him, to supply in his needs, a widow of Zarephath. Zarephath means a place of melting pots. It's not the kind of place you want to be in. Out of the frying pan into the fire, that's where he found himself. And then in this little family, Elijah stayed with them, with this woman and her son. We don't know how old the son was. We can guess maybe 8, 9, 10 years old. He stayed with them. God provided miraculously. And then crisis strike. And then it's a crisis moment. And the Bible says, after this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. Imagine, it is still drought. It's still famine. It is still a time of crisis in the nation, in the land. And this woman, she survives on a miracle. She lost everything. And here, the only thing that she has is a son. And here, her whole life came crashing down suddenly, unexpectedly. What worse fate can befall anyone? This little boy was all she had. He was her life, he was her hope, he was her future, he was her everything. And when we focus in this little picture, we find a woman shattered. Her whole life came crashing down, and she holds this dead boy in her bosom. Maybe she sat down and she sat with this boy and she held onto him for dear life, as if she can impart life in his dead body. Look at her. She held him. She grabbed onto this child, and everything around her is just black. There's nothing, she can't see anything but this child. And the next moment she lashed out against Elijah. How could you, Elijah? How could you come here? It's your fault. Elijah, you are responsible. You see, there are two ways that we usually react to a crisis. We can either fuse with the crisis, or we try to avoid the crisis. Sometimes we do both. There's the fusion. When pain comes, when crisis comes, when crises show up in our lives and in our houses, We get hooked on the pain. We get hooked on the painful thoughts, the memories, the feelings. It consumes us. We internalize everything. We ask questions. We analyze. We just become part of this crisis. The crisis becomes us. Can you imagine this woman with this boy? He's in her heart. He's in her arms. She feels him. She smells him. She listens as, is there some kind of noise coming? Maybe there's a little bit of breath left. She feels him. And then she lashed out. She pushed away. Elijah, it's you. Elijah, it's God. And the same with us. When a crisis comes, you know what it feels like. You know what it feels like if you want to go to sleep at night and you cannot sleep because this crisis is playing in your mind over and over. You feel it in your body. Wherever you go, this crisis is just like a big black shadow following you, sometimes in front of you, sometimes behind you. But all the time you are aware of this. Sometimes we try to push it away. We push it away with drugs, with alcohol. Some try to drink it away, but then they realize, but alcohol, this problem is actually a champion swimmer. The next morning, it's back. Some try the blame game. And the harder you push this, the harder you try to avoid this crisis and whatever this crisis is doing to you, the more energy it takes, the worse it gets. She tried the best, and still the boy was dead. What was Elijah's reaction to this? This is very interesting. You see, when we read the story, we tend to go from the crisis to the resurrection. We like the story from death to the resurrection, from the time that Elijah prayed over him and he came back to life, and we think this is the story. It's not the story. We like miracles. We are sometimes miracle chasers. We like to go from crisis to solution, but what is in between we miss, and therefore we miss so much. Look at Elijah. All the time this woman was dealing with this crisis, Elijah was there for her. Isn't that great? He didn't say a word. He didn't preach to her. He didn't try to teach her the principles of the kingdom. He didn't try to correct her when she lashed out against him or God. He stayed silent. He let her be. That's a difficult part, because we all want to get from the crisis to the solution. We all try to fix things so easily. And he was just there. I think, the Bible doesn't say that, but I think he cried with her. I can see Elijah shedding some tears, maybe sitting with her, maybe touching this child, trying to help her holding this child. He was there for her. His presence was enough. He didn't blame her. He didn't try to correct her. And then he says to her, "Give me your son. Give me your son." share your burden. That's the way to do it. That's the way to do it, Elijah. That's the way to do it for you and for me when we see someone in a crisis, to be there for that person, to be there available to cry with him, to be there physically, mentally, in every way. And then there comes a time to say, well, share it for me. It's too heavy for you. Share it. Let me share in it. This is still this interim phase. He didn't go from the crisis and say, well, I'm going to pray for you. Everything is going to be all right. And there's be a miracle and we have a fantastic party. No. He knew something about the valley of the shadow of death that you will have to go through, not skip, not over, but through. So he says to her, give him. In our New Testament lesson, our gospel lesson, we learned something of that when Jesus says to us, take my yoke upon you. Come to me, all ye who are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It is the Jesus thing he did. Let me share your burden. And then he says, or he took the child up to his upper room where he stayed. Elijah, what are you up to? And this is the beautiful part. He took that child. There was nothing that he could do about this child. I mean, he was just a man. He was just a prophet. So he took the child to his chambers. He shared the burden, and she gave the burden to him. She gave her son to him. There was a point in her life that she had to let go. Let someone share it with me. It was out of her hands. So there he goes, up to these chambers. And then he did something very, very interesting. He prayed over the child. So we expect him to pray over the child. But then he did something so unexpectedly. I wonder if he understood it himself. He lied on the child. He stretched himself out on this child. That was interesting. Elijah, what are you doing? You know what he did? He came between the child and God. He stepped in the middle. He was the intercessor. And that's what it means to be an intercessor, to stand between. And he identified with the child. He prayed for this child as if he was the child, as if he were dead. That's intercessing. To pray for someone, to step into his or her shoes as if I am the crisis, if I have the need. He did what the mother never could have done. Stepped between. Do you know this is what Jesus did on the cross? Jesus came between the cross that were for you and me. The cross was for us because we have sinned. Jesus came in between and he stretched himself out on this cross and he died. Elijah did the Jesus thing over this child. He cried out to God. You see, sometimes God calls us to be an Elijah. And sometimes we need an Elijah in our lives. We need someone to share our burden. Sometimes we desperately need that. Someone to help us, someone to be with us, someone to be silent with us. Talk too much. Sometimes we need someone to say to us, I will share your burden. And then sometimes we need someone to come between the burden and God. Be an Elijah. Maybe you need an Elijah this afternoon. Ask God to send someone like Elijah, but maybe God calls you to be an Elijah. How do we handle the storms of life? Today is Parents' Day. Today I think back on my parents. Parents are there to shelter us, to protect us, to care for us. Many times they take the brunt of the storm for us. Sometimes they are the Elijahs in our lives. They come between us and the storms, between us and God. I thank God for my parents. I had a father who was very soft-spoken. He was a gentleman. He was very quiet, but I know he prayed for me. When he died, the first thing that went through my mind, who is going to take his place? My mother was someone I know, she prayed for me. She was the Elijah in my life. My father was the Elijah for us. Parent, are you the Elijah for your kids? Doesn't matter how old they are or how young they are. I have a grandchild. Can you believe it? A few weeks ago, and for my grandchild, I want to be Elijah. May God help us to be Elijahs. Amen.